heard she was doing that.
Whippersnapper. Yeah, and
Bob Chumbo.
so anyway,
Bob moved out.
so she's got everything worked out right now.
They're selling off all their property here in Inglewood. They're selling off all the property in Inglewood.
It's all good.
They can bond.
Yep, exactly.
When that hospital went up, it felt like there was nothing on it for a million miles. Now that whole Schwab, that's to the west of there.
Didn't do it. All right.
Where's come from? And how can they build this so fast? We could put her in a closet.
That's okay.
Hey, when you get a chance, I don't know. I'm an idiot. I can't make it work. Right, open again? Okay, give me 1 second.
What's not working for you?
There they are.
My Wi-Fi access.
They changed mine on my phone today. Let's see where I'm on. I'm on Inglewood now. Are you on Inglewood?
Trying.
And what you do is you use your email address as your login.
Hi. We'll get to full social.
However you log into the Inglewood Gov, your
It
username.
says can't connect. Actually, it says something else, but I won't repeat it. No.
No. I expect it from you.
That's true.
No.
You worked hard to build that reputation.
You don't want to ruin it now.
I think if get him to Dugan tomorrow, hopefully, he can do a quick.
Rick, we got a phone. Who's calling?
You just got me all over your calendar, I think.
I mean,
No. Using the same information that wording that we used for the mill levy for the budget, we're using it for the mill for the police bond. So wording should be pretty standard. Before. I've almost got the council communication. I'm just waiting for a couple numbers from PFM.
I got those and those.
Especially when I do these sort of things to you, right?
Is it? Well, it's, it's dark early now and people still aren't used to it. I know. It's crazy.
Didn't you come last week?
Get to grab chairs. Get to grab chairs. I don't know.
We don't know what's going on.
Friday we got our thing.
The heck, somebody falling down the stairs?
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
There's no screams. I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Did you just get a pop? No. all that noise was you in the vending
We didn't hear any screams. We didn't
machine.
get too
Someone took a
worried.
header down the stairs. What were you trying? Were you shaking it? Give me that chip.
Got stuck.
Give me the
stuck.
change.
I want the change. Oh, goodness.
So is Rita right? You taught that machine to give you your change.
You're messing with the library board.
Haven't heard from Linda or Amy, huh?
We heard from Linda. She's going to be out of town.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, but Amy.
I know my.
That's what happens when you
furnace
have to
doesn't
wrestle
seem
with a machine.
A little bear over there.
Saturday after the parade.
Okay, we're combining with them.
So Amy's sick, so she wants to call in. So I don't know if we need to call her. I don't.
Well, then I'll sit next to you.
I don't know. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea.
Not doing well.
Hopefully, it doesn't
We could all move down so Joe didn't feel so low.
Yeah, I mean, I've got it.
Head of the table now.
Thought maybe you're going to be Amy tonight.
Well, looks like I might be encroaching on somebody's space.
It is. It's got the Inglewood City Council all over it. It must be your guys's.
All your mail. Mary
All
did
your
it.
mail. There you go.
How's that?
That's what Allison says. It's all your mail.
All right.
That's what she said.
Good evening. How are you? Good, and you? Good. Did you enjoy your Thanksgiving?
The old college trash.
Good.
Yeah, there's yours, correct? Amy's. It's the second line down in the address.
Oh, I can't read upside down either. Rita, your name is not distinguishable upside down for me. Do you want me to get that for you, Scott?
Should have. I'll take care of it when I get home. Oh, yeah.
Amy? Yeah. You got your speakerphone still? Okay. All right. Hello.
Hey, Amy.
I'm all right. How are you guys?
Great.
I think yours is the last one.
Well, if you're all right, why aren't you here?
Oh, I just want to go through Rick's mail, that's all.
Yeah.
I don't blame you. You've got mail.
Okay, we're recording? Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the City of Inglewood City Council study session. Our first agenda item is a financial report. Finance and Administrative Services Director Kathleen Rinkel is present to discuss the October financial report. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. This is our full report rather than our abbreviated version, so I'm going to hit some of the highlights and not go page for page, but a few of the pages. The first page, what I'd like to point out is the very first paragraph that at this point we are expecting to be our general fund to be revenues exceeding expenditures by a little over $400,000 by the end of the year. So we're in good shape there. And as you can see, towards the end of the year, we have more expenditures than we have revenues. So the trend, as you see the revenues come in, it is expected that our revenues will exceed those towards the last 2 months, and that's typically seasonal as we try and get all of our bills in. The general revenue funds on page 2, at 83% of the year, we have received 85%. I can't even talk tonight. Sorry, 85% of the revenue that we're expecting. This is above the average, 5-year average. We've received the revenue for back to school, and we're awaiting the revenue that'll come in with the holiday spending. On the next page, our favorite page, we have Area 7, who is still lagging, but they're lagging by less this month than they were by last month. Last month they were lagging $542,000. This month we're lagging $475,000. So we're improving there. Then I would like to move you to page 5 and point out in the general fund revenues that the budget is $43.9 million, and what we're expecting to collect, even though we've collected $38.7 through October, we're expecting to collect $44 million by the end of the year. That will leave us a little bit above revenue projection budget by about $100,000, which means we're expecting our expenditures to be the other $300,000 that gets us to the $400,000 difference. To page 7, what I'd like to point out are the wonderful charts on the right-hand side. They give you a very good idea of where we've spent and the trends in the past years and where we are for 2016. On page 7, we're pretty much in line in all areas with the budget for our estimate. So feeling pretty comfortable there with the revenues. On page 8, you can see a nice chart in the middle of the page that talks about how we've changed from year to year with our revenues. Notice we've only got 2 that declined. The rest of them are inclining.
Actually 4, but
I'm sorry?
it's actually 4.
Oh, if you count the 2 teeny tiny ones, which I was trying to ignore. Okay.
These graphs have been expanded, so it's easier to notice now. So.
Yeah, I know. I know. I'll have to make them tiny again next time. Okay. And then the other page that has graphs on the revenues, the intergovernmental and charges and so forth, is on page 13. What I'd like to point out is that 2016 on the intergovernmental and the charges for services have dropped from the prior years. The intergovernmental is our grants, so we're getting fewer grants than we have in prior years. We're hoping to fix that, make it so that we're getting more grants. Hopefully folks have grant money we can apply for. And then the charges for services, most of that was from the EMS that went with the fire department, and that's why it's lower budget in 2016 than we've seen across the other years. Recreation is up a little bit from prior years. The fines and forfeitures are down a little bit due to the community policing and the courts on the fines, the way they're managing them. And then interest looks like a big drop, but it's not a big number. It's about $15,000 is we're expecting to get less than budget this year, and that was because at the beginning of the year when we set the budget, they were expecting rates to go up sooner than they are. They're just starting up now. On page 14 in the middle, I know this is of interest on the incentives that we give to the different organizations to get them into the city. This is what the incentives have paid for and what the different entities have used them for. And as you can see, a lot of it is to help with our infrastructure. On page 15, I wanted to spend a little bit of time because this will be part of our next discussion on the general fund debt service. I wanted to point out that we have 2 payments that typically happen with our debt service. Those happen in May and November. So as we go forward in selling our bonds, we'll be looking at and we're planning to sell them towards the beginning of this year so we can get started with the police station. We should have 2 payments that we'll have to make. And so we'll want to be collecting taxes this year, and we will be bringing forward a bill to get those taxes and estimate what they are, and then for 17 so that we can start collecting. And then the structure of the debt will equal what we structure for that first year.
Just to be clear, even though we collected even though we start it now, that we won't get that until 2018, right?
No. We'll be bringing the bill forward next Monday at the regular council meeting, and what it'll ask for is the mills that will equal what we would expect for the first year, based on our ballot language, and we'll start collecting that, and then we'll sell the bonds, and we will structure the bonds to equal what we put forth in that debt collection for the first year.
So help me
Makes sense.
understand. I apologize for taking a few minutes here, but
No, that's fine.
Just to make sure the community understands, and I understand as well, we're raising property taxes.
Yes.
If the property tax they're paying in the next February and April are for 2016. So how will we be receiving 2017 property taxes in 2017 when they're always collected in arrears?
We're putting forth the mill levy for 2016 to be collected in 17. It will then capture the money in 17 for us to be able to make the payments. If we don't do that, we'd have to take it out of our general fund, and I'd rather not do that.
Another question from a cash flow perspective: were we able to structure these notes so that the payments are at a favorable schedule when we're post collections of our property taxes?
I'm going to leave that for the next presentation, if I may.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank
I
you.
see some nodding behind you. So I guess I just want to be conscious of our cash
I
flow
was
situation,
really happy
obviously.
they just didn't poke me in the back because they would do that too. Okay.
Oh, they're nice. But,
I know. So On to page 19, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fund balance. As you can see, with the $400,000 expectancy over budget that we plan for the general fund, it will help our fund balance a little bit more. And we should be above the 16.66% target at 17.5 is our expectation.
Wait a minute. Are you saying page 19?
19, yes.
Page 19.
Oh, it's 19 on mine. I'm sorry. Hopefully
Okay.
it's the same on yours.
Blue paragraph.
Looks like this,
Yeah, page
with the wiggly line at the top. Okay.
But it's 19 of the report.
And other than that, we've got our favorite page on page 24 that lines out the individual items for revenue, expenditures, and gives you the estimate for each one on those. Those are what I would call the highlights. Any questions?
Questions or comments from council? Seeing none, thank you for the presentation.
Welcome.
Without anything further, I'll move on to agenda item 2. That's police building update. Again, Finance Administrative Services Director Kathleen Rinkel is present to discuss, along with some friends, I think.
Absolutely. We've got Maddie and David here from PFM. We'll have you come on
Evening,
up.
please join us.
Let's drag your own chair now.
Yeah.
Musical chairs. Good evening, Mayor, council members. Thank you for giving us some time on the agenda this evening to give you an update. First and foremost, congratulations on the successful ballot measure. Last we saw you was, I believe, when you were adopting the ordinance to place the ballot or the measure on the ballot. So really just want to give an update tonight, answer any questions that you may have. We'll be talking about the mill levy discussion that Kathy brought up, and kind of give you a plan for what to expect over the next 60, 90 days in terms of the financing for the police building. Moving through our first topic, discussing the underwriter RFP. I believe the last time we were here, that was out on the street, so to speak. It was issued out on Friday, September 23rd. It was released on the Rocky Mountain BidNet system through the city's procurement department, and PFM also sent the RFP specifically to 13 local firms to make sure that they were aware and able to ask questions and respond. The city received 9 proposals. PFM, in conjunction with the city, conducted a review of those 9 proposals, ranking them from sort of highest to lowest, and decided on 5 firms to interview should the election be successful on November 9th. So that occurred. Those interviews occurred on November 14th. Again, with 5 firms that responded that we felt were kind of in the city's best interest to talk with. They had a clear understanding of what the city was looking to do, an understanding of the financing plan, particularly as it pertained to ratings presentations and structuring, and really looked to their current market commentary given the post-election kind of turn up that's happened in terms of the market. And so really wanted to find a firm that was able to represent the city's best interests, help navigate through the pricing discussions, as well as the rating presentations. After those interviews, PFM worked with the city to discuss pros and cons of each firm that presented, and the city selected to move forward with Stiefel. Representatives are sitting behind me. And the city council will be presented with a contract for those services, I believe, at the December 5th. Hopefully next week at the city council meeting on Monday. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Can also introduce folks from Stiefel behind me.
Questions or comments from council? Councilmember Barentine?
When you give us the contract, will you include the copy of the RFP that was provided for them as well?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
And do we get a list of any of the other companies, or how do you do that?
Yep, I think we can definitely provide the RFP as well as the distribution list that it was sent to, and a list of the firms that responded. Mhm.
Other questions, comments? You got more to present here?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. So, want to invite Josh and Andrea up to the table to introduce themselves, as well as Stiefel Nicholas. The city, for some commentary, has worked with Stiefel in the past, and so they are very familiar with the city's debt structuring.
Good evening. Welcome. Sorry, let's make a little room for our guest here. Sorry, we don't have enough chairs for you.
We have one over here.
Yeah. Welcome. Good evening.
Thank you. I'm Josh Benninghoff from Stiefel.
I'm Andrea Vlad with Stiefel as well.
Can you go real close? We're trying to record.
Oh, sorry. Josh Benninghoff.
And Andrea Vlad.
Thank you.
Sure. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in the city's solicitation process. Certainly a robust process. We appreciate the opportunity to actually participate in person and answer questions from Eric and from Kathy. Given, as Maddie described, some volatility in the market over the last couple of weeks, it's important for all of us to stay coordinated, and I think the team it definitely has been so far. And as we move forward, there's certainly. We're 8 miles down the road, so it's easy for us to give live market commentary as things arise.
Any basic comments on our timing, so to speak, and interest rate risk that we're kind of incurring moving forward?
Sure. Nothing's final until it's final. Kind of since the election, rates have moved up, depending on where you are, how long the term you choose to borrow, between 40 and 60 basis points. Most of that change happened in the first week, immediately following the election. Largely a focus on the potential for higher inflation going forward, and just an overall higher rate environment. The Fed's expected to raise rates. There's actually 100% market consensus upon that, which means don't bet on it. Here in 2 weeks, and that raises just the front end of the yield curve. That's the very shortest of rates. The long-term rates, though, have still moved up as well. As Maddie described, it's 60 to 90 days away. The market, since that first week of upward rate movement, has largely stabilized, but it's still ticking up slowly. Today, rates moved up about 3 basis points. So. The overall movement's slowing, but last week was also a holiday week, so there wasn't much new supply in the market. The next 2 weeks here should be fairly instructive as to what rates look like for the coming future.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from council? Lorette?
They mentioned that you'd worked with the city before. What have you worked with them on?
The firm has. It was actually our late colleague, Vicki Maddox, who served the city for a very long time. I'm not sure if anyone here worked with or remembers Vicki. Vicki unfortunately passed now 3 years ago. I was going to say 4. It's not right yet. 3 years ago, and Vicki always held Englewood as one of her very favorite clients. She worked on the golf course financing. She worked on Pirates Cove. My kids now go to Pirates Cove. We're appreciative of everyone's efforts in that. But the firm, I think, has worked on it's either 6 or 8 transactions for the city of Englewood.
Thank you. I think we can move on.
So moving on to the next section, as Kathy discussed, there will be a first reading for an ordinance for the mill levy for this financing next week. Now, obviously, the bonds have not been sold yet, but we anticipate that is going to happen in the first or second quarter, probably April, no later than, of 2017. The city has some options in terms of this. Our recommendation is to levy the mill that was allowed for in the ballot question to be able to make principal and interest payments in both June and December of next year. The city sends payments to the trustee in May and November. If the city does not make that determination and levy the mill, then the city is either going to have to pay for those payments out of your general fund, or structure the transaction such that no interest is paid until 2018 when the next levy can be made, which would then increase your total repayment and interest costs on the overall borrowing, which is not something that we would recommend. So we will be working with the city to prepare the numbers for that ordinance to increase the mill for this financing. The city already adopted the mill for the general obligation bonds on November 21st, so last week, for the 2010 general obligation refunding bonds. So this ordinance will be a supplemental levy to that levy that's already been adopted. More of a, I'm sure Dugan can add more commentary, but more of a legal technicality. The total amount that will show sort of in the end is going to be the cumulative of those two.
Thank you, Lorette.
Any questions on those?
This kind of addresses that. Just when you give us the contract, could we have the answer to the what's your credit strategy and current rating, and the commentary, just if you, a little how you answered those questions? That would be helpful.
Oh, sure. For the interview. Okay.
Since it wasn't included.
All good on that? All right, so moving on to the calendar. As we just mentioned, there will be an ordinance presented next week for first reading to the City Council for the mill levy for debt service. The city has been working on an RFP for an owner's rep / project manager over the last several weeks, and Kathy can probably speak a little bit more to the process, but anticipate that to be out this week. And so what will be happening in the city will be issuing the RFP, evaluating responses, and then in the first quarter of next year, we would anticipate coming back to the City Council with 3 ordinances or contracts. So one would be the contract from the firm that wins the RFP, as well as a reimbursement ordinance and a parameters ordinance. So the reimbursement ordinance would allow the city to reimburse itself for any funds that are spent ahead of the bond issuance. So if after selecting someone from the RFP process, if there is a contract that needs to be signed and any payments that are made up front prior to the bonds being issued, the city can make those payments and then reimburse itself back into the general fund. And then the parameters ordinance will be essentially the parameters that allow the city to issue the bonds. So there will be sort of a not to exceed amount that will generally match what is in the bond question that was presented to voters.
Questions, comments?
Good. All right. Last section. So just to speak to the plan of finance, and obviously we're here, and folks from CFL are here to answer any questions that you may have, but really over the next several weeks we're going to be working as a finance team to monitor the market, as Josh mentioned, to see what's happening post potential, or I guess mostly 100% likely rate rise in December, what may or may not be happening in January, and the continuing fallout of the election and any policies that come into play during the first 100 days of the new administration. We'll be working to structure the bonds to match within what we will be levying from the taxes for next year, as well as determining what the total proceeds that are needed as the city goes through the RFP process for a owner's rep project manager. And so that will include, obviously, coming back to council to receive approval for the parameters ordinance, making presentations to rating agencies, determining that credit strategy, which we will be updating the city council on as we move through that process.
Is the structure of the term of the bonds something that we can kind of decide or get a recommendation from you guys on?
Sure. So when we were preparing the numbers for the ballot question, the city typically has done a 20-year term. There's some benefits from a market standpoint to looking at a 25-year term. So we made sure within the parameters to make sure the city was able to utilize either of those structures and can kind of do anywhere in between.
When we ran the numbers at $9 per 100,000 of home value, do you think that was a 20-year term?
I'd have to go back and check. I can get back to Kathy and she can send that.
No problem. It just seemed to me that a longer term would make some sense here. But obviously, I'm open to recommendations or evaluations on that.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at sort of the pros and cons of the total interest expense. Obviously, the longer term you have, the more interest you're paying overall in the life of the bonds. But obviously, you need to be sensitive to taxpayer impact and things like that.
And again, going back to my cash flow question, we can structure it to where the payments are due when we want them due, where, after we get our property tax collections, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. The city currently, and I don't think we would deviate from this structure, has a June interest payment and then a December principal and interest payment, which allows for the full collection of property taxes between the February to April time frame to then be able to make those payments.
And still stick with the 2 annual payments.
Absolutely.
Structure. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Okay. Seeing none, I guess we're off to the races here. We'll be talking about this more next week. Thank you again for coming down, and thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, cruising right along. Moving on to our third agenda item, Historic Preservation Commission. Senior Planner Harold Stitt is present to discuss the Historic Preservation Commission memorandum. Back to me. Yeah, me too. Sometimes during this meeting. Trying not to.
Get old, make sure you get rich.
Trying on that. Mr. Stitt.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight we'd like to spend a few minutes talking about a proposal for a historic preservation board. And I'm sure, as you've seen in the memo that was provided, there are provisions in the proposed ordinance to create such a board. And but beyond that, we've posed 3 questions that we think are important for Council to consider as we move forward with a historic preservation board. And I'd like to just kind of reiterate those questions just so we can kick off the conversation. As you know from the memo, there are provisions in the Title 16 of the Inglewood Municipal Code for historic preservation designations, both structures and districts. So the first question is, how will the proposed Historic Preservation Board operate in light of the Planning and Zoning Commission's and the City Council's responsibilities set forth in Title 16 of the Municipal Code?
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that question.
Well, in Title 16, in Chapter 6, Section 11, it's the historic preservation provisions, which were added in probably about 10 years ago or so. And it provides for the preservation and protection of building structures, sites, and areas that have historic or cultural significance to the city. And the process that's described in the ordinance sets forth several different steps that are required based on whether it's a district or an individual or a group of buildings, for instance. So, for instance, an application is submitted by a property owner, and again, this is voluntary. This is not mandatory. So a property owner might submit an application requesting that the city designate his or her structure historic. There's additional information that would then be provided to substantiate the historic nature of that structure or structures. And then it's reviewed by the Planning Commission, during which they hold a public hearing. They make a determination whether the structure is in fact historic and meets the criteria. It's then forwarded on to the City Council for final review and approval. Similar type arrangement would be for a district. The difference with a historic district is that you would have to have, or the applicant would have to have, 2/3 of the property owners to submit approval for such a designation. Lacking that 2/3 majority, it would not be considered by the Planning Commission nor forwarded to City Council.
Sorry, what was the 2/3 rule again? Is that?
Say, for instance, you have a neighborhood that has 50 homes in it. You would need to have
Adjacent
2/3 of those properties sign on to an application to create a historic district before the city could consider that.
Within whatever boundaries were created or
Correct.
proposed?
Correct.
Is that how it is currently?
Yes.
How many do we have?
We have just one, Arapahoe Acres.
And it went through the city process or just the national?
Probably
It went through the national process. It may have been designated before the city adopted a historic preservation ordinance.
So I guess what my question was is how many does the city have? How many properties have gone through this process, and how many does the city currently have? So I guess that would be
City,
0.
We have not had any properties go through this process.
Yeah, we never actually got around to establishing the commission. I think this was kind of envisioned, but obviously never came to fruition. And so I think the question is, do we like this structure, or is this something we want to modify?
Then I guess I'm still confused because what I'm asking is that this already set up that process. Nobody has ever used that process. That he's not suggesting that, nor did we need a historic preservation board to do that, because he didn't mention the historic preservation board once in that process. And I was just asking how many we had. So
the reference to commission in this section of the municipal code refers to the Planning and Zoning Commission. There's been some confusion that because the word commission was in there, it was referencing Historic Preservation Commission, but in fact, in Title 16, the definition of commission is the Planning and Zoning Commission.
I see. So they would be the reviewing body.
Right. Basically,
Planning and Zoning is currently the reviewing body on these actions.
And then on to City Council for final approval. Basically, the question is, would you think it wise to move these responsibilities out of Title 16, or at least out from under the purview of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and move those into a Historic Preservation Board?
Questions or comments from council regarding that? Go ahead, Rick.
I'm waiting till we get down to 215.5. I want to talk about that.
at least for me, for this point, we've had a process in place. It hasn't been used. It seems to have some criteria in there, and you have public process already with the Planning and Zoning Board, so I don't think it's necessary. We can always revisit it after we get up and running with the Historic Preservation Board to see how it's working, but for right now, I don't see that there's any reason to change that.
Well, and so the way this is structured, they don't necessarily have a role, and so would they have a role in designating these areas, right? Am I right there?
Thought part of what we had discussed with them and why we had them was because they were going to go ahead and come up with some of the ideas of what their role would be and how they would be a player in that before we go shoving a bunch of responsibilities on them to see exactly how that would work. And since nobody's taken advantage of this for 10 years, then maybe they could take a look at whether it was an onerous process, whether it worked well, whether anybody tried to. Let's get a little history first before we go changing any of that type of process.
Well, and Dugan's office has provided some proposed language for a historic preservation board, which in your mind, under this structure, would be different than the current policy, and they would have the purview of review of these historic issues rather than planning and zoning. Is that correct?
Well, yes, I think that was where I was coming from, and then we're talking it over with CD, Community Development, which is where this would kind of emanate from anyway. We came up with these other issues with the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that ordinance already being in place. This is just really a rough draft of what the board's composition would be, its powers, duties. It's just a starting point for council discussion.
Yes. Okay. Mayor Pro Tem
Just
Jill?
to complete my comment,
Sorry,
I don't think at any time we thought that they were going to be changing anything or having the authority of planning and zoning. That's not what was discussed.
Let's go to Mayor Pro Tem Jill. Oh, sorry, Mr. Yates.
I've got a question here. Councilwoman Barentine said shoving responsibilities off on to them. Who is them that you're speaking of?
Well, that was kind of loosely stated. I didn't say shoving responsibilities off on them. I think what we had decided was that they were going to come up with kind of a mission statement,
Who's
an
they?
idea. The Historic Preservation Board that we're creating, and that it was not going to be anything where they had authority over any property, giving them the same authority that the Planning and Zoning Board has currently under any section would be giving them more authority than what we agreed to from the beginning until the Historic Preservation Board has an opportunity to go ahead and take a look at what's been going on, what the processes are, and where we would like to go further with this.
Okay. One thing that might help is, I think from what I gathered from our kind of consensus and vision for this was not that the Historic Commission would be designating entire new areas, but simply individual properties, and maybe that's something that might narrow the scope of the conversation a little bit, and creating a historical district could remain under the purview of planning and zoning, where some smaller registry or something locally that would just be individual properties where the property owner was a willing sort of participant in that, was kind of what I had in my mind. I don't know, others can comment a little bit on that or ask questions about that. Mayor Pro Tem Gillett?
Yeah,
I'll come back to you, Steve.
Am I correct that you put 215.1 purpose and then 215.5 powers of the board in here? Is that? I'm trying to figure out where this came from. Is it something that's in the ordinance now?
No, that's the proposed language.
No, that's the proposed.
So I just wanted to make sure, because I think I'm in agreement with Member Barentine. Some of the stuff is alarming or of concern to me. I like paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Paragraph 3, stabilize or improve the aesthetic. I think that at least my envisioning is to let this board look and see what we're doing, see what we could do to improve and make recommendations of what they even want to be about. I think that some of these could very well fit into that. Promote the use of outstanding historical architecture, but I don't think I want them to be in charge of stabilizing or improving aesthetics and economic vitality. It just seems like an overstretch to me, and I think I'm in agreement with Ms. Barentine on that. I'd like to dial this down a little bit and say, let's give them a broad range of saying, tell us what you think you could do best for us. That's kind of what I was hoping, and maybe I didn't express that point myself. And then when we go down to the powers and duties, the powers, I don't even understand that paragraph, and help me understand it. Aesthetic standing of the city cannot be maintained or enhanced by disregarding the historical, architecture, and geographical heritage of the city and by ignoring the destruction of defacement of such. Can you explain to me what that paragraph means?
I think that was taken from the information that was provided either by the Historical Preservation Society in their presentation or the individual who presented from the State Historical Society. So that's just, hate to say boilerplate language, but it's kind of generic language. And certainly if council is interested, that more specific information can be placed in that section as opposed to this kind of broad.
Is there a way, maybe I'm the only one who thinks that's an odd paragraph, but if there's a way we could just have their duties like other boards of just reporting to council, like the Code Enforcement Advisory Committee. They have an idea, they think this idea is great, let's present that to council, let council decide if that's how we want to move forward. I don't want them to have powers. That's our job. With the powers, we're the legislative branch of the city. So I would like maybe, that's just my input on this. I love the idea of the committee, but I kind of want them to see where they think they can help us the best, and then maybe we work into some of this. It just seems odd right up front. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. Going back to Mr. Yates.
What I kind of saw for the committee would be primarily in the beginning to be identifying historical property, coming up with some standards of what would be a historical property. But I'm not in favor of letting them create zoning and saying this one's on the historical committee. They can make recommendations, but I don't want to give them that power right off the bat, because frankly we don't know where or what this is going to turn into. So in the beginning, I think we just need to identify and get some ideas.
A historic district is not a zoning classification. It's a separate designation that would be placed on either a building or a series of buildings or a neighborhood, for instance, either by a historic preservation commission and council, for instance. So there are some zoning aspects to it. At the time Title 16-611 was created, there was no historic preservation board. So those powers and duties were placed with the Planning Commission. Now, in terms of how this would work, it's a voluntary system that's been described here. Also, doing a cultural or historic survey of the city is not something that our current staff has either the technical skills, the time, or the resources to do. And in communities where they have historic preservation commissions that have done this, it's taken quite a bit of staff time, dedicated staff time who have expertise in architectural and historic areas, as well as perhaps in most cases hiring consultants to do that. So either provide resources for training for a board to be able to do the historic structures survey, or provide funding so that a consultant of some sort could be retained to do that. You could spend, even though Englewood's a very small community, you could easily spend a year, because a full-blown analysis requires determining when the building was built, the materials, has it been changed. The State Historical Society has a long list of things that you need to look at in order to determine whether or not it has historic status. And it's not simply just the building was built in 1903.
Okay. Zoning wasn't necessarily the word I meant. But thank you for clarifying that. The first 2 years I would expect identifying, and I understand the resources. So what kind of resources, if we were to go down this avenue, what do you think is reasonable?
I'm not sure I can answer that. We haven't looked into what a historic survey might cost. We can investigate that and provide information to council at a later date.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Barrington?
I agree with Councilmember Gillett and in part with Councilmember Yates on this. I do believe it's zoning. When you say that there wasn't a historic preservation board at the time to take on the powers and duties, it is not our intent when we talked about the historic preservation board to give them any powers. It was supposed to be beginning, at least, and at its inception, to be an advisory board. I appreciate your concern about doing studies and addressing things, but we don't even know that they would be doing that. So kind of acting as if taking on this language and this additional power for them would somehow be saving us money is kind of a straw man, because while it may be something they want to do, we don't know whether we're going to do that, whether it's on a voluntary basis. And what you said is not on a voluntary basis. What the Planning and Zoning Board can currently do, according to the intro that you gave, is go ahead and with enough people, go ahead and make an area that everybody then is required to do, even people that didn't want to do it. So what we were talking about was for this board to go ahead and be an advisory council to get it started, and then things like doing historical surveys, what the cost would be, what kind of training they would need would be something that they would have a discussion with us on if they decided that they wanted to do that. So I think this is, as to Councilmember Gillett's point, this is just far overreaching from where I saw this board going. It was my intention that we wanted to start it and have it be advisory, and this isn't even close.
Thank you. Councilmember Russell.
I actually agree with Councilmember Barentine and Councilmember Gillett. And however, I think we need to have some goals of what we want to see at the beginning. And I think it's really hard for an ordinance to be written unless they know what council is looking for, which I guess that's what we're discussing tonight. But the goals are really what we need to determine what we want that board to do. And once we determine what that board ought to do, I think that would give staff direction. I do not want the board to become overreaching, and in some of this that I read, it concerns me a great deal that certified local government would get involved in this and then really control the direction that we're going.
Thank you. I think we're hearing fairly clearly that the purpose is a advisory body to council for recommendations. I would say regarding policy, community celebration of historic, issues in the city of Inglewood. I don't know if people think that's even too broad. The other possibilities I think that have been brought up would be a recommendation on a survey, a recommendation on, whether or not a basic registry should be put forward. Some of those kind of basic duties, at least initially, is kind of at least what I'm envisioning, some basic recommendations from them. Should the city spend this type of money to do a survey on this? Should we build a registry or not? Those type of policy considerations, as well as non-policy issues of, hey, maybe we should have an event or something that celebrates some specific place or specific date or something like that that's specific to, historically significant to the city of Inglewood. I think the separate question, separate from that, duties and powers, and I think we heard pretty clearly that one paragraph, I think, folks had some issues with. I think the separate question would be, should we keep the P&Z structure of allowing, that 2/3 to designate a historical area, even though nobody's ever used it before? Is that a policy that we want to continue on with? I think that's kind of a separate question in my mind. So perhaps some feedback on the purpose, how I stated that, if you feel like that's somewhat appropriate, or if you feel like there's some feedback on that. And then secondarily, do you want to look at that policy of the 2/3 for designation of an historical area as the current policy stands? Go ahead.
I agree.
Okay.
I'd like to get some more information on it in order to make the way that it got stated for what the powers of planning and zoning were not what we were talking about necessarily here. And so since there's been some of the structure in place, I'd like to see how it's been used, if anybody's come forward with it. And it's not to say that in a year or two, like Councilmember Yates said, that we might not go, wow, we have a whole different thing that we'd like this board to do, but we'll have them as partners with some information and getting started, at least to figure that out. But to start, I don't think it should be that hard to give them goals for an advisory board. So, but I do appreciate where you're going with that.
And so you just want to, on the P&Z piece, you just want to gather some information about whether or not we've seen an application come forward. Is that the question?
Well, just a little bit more information. I mean, it's been in place for 10 years. Obviously, nobody's taken advantage of it. And why? And maybe we could get some information from the board if they say, well, here's the reason why people haven't come forward and tried to do that in the past, or it's just something that doesn't really work for our city and we need to change that, or we stick to this is an individual property decision and we don't want to have any vehicle in the city that would take anybody in an area that didn't agree to it. We don't want to even have that vehicle available, or we do. So I think we have a couple of things on the P&Z side to decide as well. Because I agree with you. I'm not sure I want that to stay. whether that fits us, and that's why nobody's used it, whether we want it to be more of a tool, I don't know.
Well, and the good news is, obviously they make a recommendation to council, and council has final approval on something like that. That would be very substantial. Given that, I'm probably okay with that policy as it stands. I agree that we should probably gather some information to feel it out, whether that needs some changes. Any other comments? And I think we heard a fairly clear rejection of certified local government involvement here. Is that fairly clear? I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, and so I think that's a fairly clear rejection of that kind of a thought. Go ahead, Rita.
Actually, I was just going to suggest that we ask Councilmember Martinez if she has any input on this.
Sure.
Got you on the phone.
Amy, are you still there? We might have lost her. Amy, are you still there? Uh-oh. She might have us muted sometimes.
Now it's gone.
Yeah,
It
damn. Did I just hang up on her?
You just hung up on her.
Hey, in my defense, you guys have witnessed that she was unresponsive prior to me moving the phone, so I think we might have disconnected prior. Would you mind giving her another shot here?
Texted her too.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Does anybody else have any other comments regarding the potential purpose of this body? And maybe my recommendation would be to take another crack at it and just bring it back to us. I guess we could take council's will. Do we want to have another study session on this topic, or are we comfortable with them bringing forward some language at a regular meeting? Go ahead.
Considering we had such a huge disconnect here, I would like it to come back to a study session.
Fair enough.
I'm a little concerned.
Fair enough. Other direction then? Anybody else have any other comments or direction to try to give them a better idea of what we're thinking? Does staff have any questions to try to get at that? Hopefully we've answered most of them. Go ahead, Mayor Pro Tem Gillett.
Yeah. Would it be okay if we just have their initial task, kind of like we did with the budget committee? We kind of let them form how they wanted, what would be helpful.
Hang on just a second. Amy, are you there?
Joe hung up on you.
Sorry about that, Amy. We lost you there. I don't know if you've...
Are you there? And I'm like, I'm here.
Okay, yeah, we weren't hearing you for some reason. Then I adjusted the phone, and apparently I hung up on you, so I apologize. I was not intentional, I promise. Any comments to add to our discussion regarding historic preservation?
Yeah, I actually agree with a lot of what has been said. I think it's smarter to kind of dial back the responsibility until the group is formed and kind of gets a solid ground, and then maybe we can give them more responsibility as they want it or desire it, and I feel comfortable with that. I'm also wondering if, with P&Z, I wonder if, I don't know that it needs to be in this language anywhere, but if it would be smart to have a member of the historic preservation be kind of a liaison to P&Z when those discussions are happening, so maybe there can be some kind of at least communications between the two groups on those topics.
Thank you. Not a bad recommendation there as far as, if P&Z does have something like this come forward, should this body be involved in that process with P&Z?
We don't have a council person as a liaison for a reason, because they're a quasi-judicial board. To have somebody then who is officially on a board of that type who doesn't have a vote but has, by our wishes, some authority in giving them direction, I think it's unfortunately, I don't think it's possible to really do that and have it be clean. So,
Mayor Pro Tem Gillett, did you have a comment there?
When she called it, I was just saying, kind of like, let's let them help form with us where they'd like to go, and we, with them together, maybe having them here say, here's where your charter is, let's go do this.
Yeah, and I think if we just leave it relatively broad and say they can make recommendations as to policy and historical issues and that kind of thing, we can leave it broad, and their mission can kind of be, at least initially, to make those initial recommendations and see what we can kind of agree upon. Manager Keck, did you have something?
Yeah, Mayor, just two comments. Number one, recognizing that we aren't going to be moving forward with an ordinance immediately, you obviously will be making some appointments or reappointments to boards and commissions here fairly shortly. So the question to the council would be, do you want us to solicit applications for a board that's not yet formulated? Because again, your next appointment opportunity wouldn't be until is that June or July of next year of 2017. So that's question number one. And then question two, I think a lot of good points have been raised. I think Councilmember Barentine raised a good point about trying to grapple with this issue of why hasn't anyone utilized the existing process that's in place, and just a little bit of direction from council on how you want us to quantify that or come up with some data that would support the efficacy or not very efficient functionality of that ordinance from council would be helpful for staff.
Thank you. Manager Keck does bring up an interesting point, and that is kind of the onus, I think, and why we schedule it for tonight was to try to figure out whether or not we should be accepting applications at this time. As far as the why no use on the other issue, in my mind, something like that would have to be very narrowly targeted to just a few sort of properties. The idea of getting 2/3 support in a very broad area, I think, is just politically unpalatable in Inglewood, candidly. Councilmember Barentine? Sorry, Rick, did you have something else?
No, sir, sorry.
No problem. You'd have to ask the bid, because it is possible. And they were taxing themselves. So, I mean, I know this is property issue, but that was a money issue, too. I don't think we have a problem doing the board in the middle of a section there. I mean, you obviously have an audience that's a constituency that's very interested in this, and I don't think that would be a problem if we put it off. I don't think we have to solicit them for this go-round, but it's not like there would be that big of a deal to go ahead and go through some applications and go ahead and do this board as soon as we have it in. Sure. Given that there might be some people who go, oh, if they're going to write the board that way, I don't want to serve. So I would like to have it in place so that they know what they're getting themselves into before they apply, but I don't think that's a big deal.
So some suggestion, I think, of waiting until the next period, perhaps, gathering some interested parties, contacts or something. Yeah.
Actually, I don't think we have to wait till June. I mean, if we put this in...
Yeah, you're saying we could do a special interview process.
Yeah, I don't think it's one board.
And so I guess I'm just saying to Manager Keck, perhaps the solution is to say, hey, there's a future board coming on, not exactly accept applications, but at least notify the public that this may be coming online soon, and perhaps even going as far as gathering interested parties' contact information. Would that be appropriate?
Part of me is like...
Should we just wait? Is that what you're kind of thinking?
Yeah. Let's determine what we're going to do first before we start looking for people to fill something we don't know what we want them to do.
Fair enough. So should Manager Keck let the public and the applicants know that there may be a future body coming on board, or should we just remain silent and not take applications for this? That's the question.
I kind of think they know.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is we've had a couple people ask. So I just want to tell them either it's hold off and keep your ink dry for a minute.
Yeah, they can only be on the board if they've listened to this meeting. Then they would know.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem Gillett.
Can we just form it ad hoc?
Good. That's not a bad idea.
I get one every now and then.
Yeah. Other comments, suggestions? Do you have direction on that? Yes, is that clear as mud? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
When is the deadline for the application for this go-around? Is it the beginning of January?
Yeah, I always think of it as around the end of the year. We're trying to look right now since
Friday the January 6th.
Friday, January 6th.
Okay, so that only leaves a couple of weeks, I guess, then.
Yep. Well, a little over a month.
You thinking of applying?
No, but I'm just thinking, I guess I don't see any particular reason in waiting other than we're trying to figure out the language of, what they're going to do, but we probably need a couple of meetings in order to do that, so.
Yeah, you'd prefer staff to begin accepting applications now?
I mean, I would prefer to just get going with it.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's an
Do you like the idea of, staff sort of letting them know rather than accepting formal applications and just saying keeping a list of interested parties, or what are you suggesting here?
I mean, I was doing it the full-on, regular, appropriate way, which is, I guess would be all of us agreeing on the language of this group and then putting it out there for folks to apply for the next round. But I know that's pretty tight turnaround time.
Yeah, and I think what you'd be advocating for then would be, rather than another study session, it coming forward, the language for the commission coming forward at our next meeting so that we could get it approved prior to the application deadline. Is that fair?
I would be fine with that. I'm just not sure, what the group thinks about. Is that too short of a turnaround time? Does that leave some folks out who may want to apply for this who don't know about it yet? Or, not sure.
Somebody want to help me with that? Councilmember Barentine?
Amy, I don't think that there's time between now and then between now and the deadline for us to come up with the language, approve what the responsibilities or the duties will be of what's going on, and then get the application. I think that everybody kind of thought it was okay, and what Rick suggested is a good idea, is that as soon as we have that information, if they'll take a list of people that are interested, and it's not that big of a, they'll take a list of people that are interested once they know what the structure is of the board, whether they're still interested or not, and then we can do it mid-term. We could have formed the historic board. We don't have to wait till June.
But agreed, there's probably not enough time to have another study session and then approve it prior to the deadline.
And still get applications in from people, yeah. And with the holidays and everything, it probably would be nicer to let people know. It gives them a little bit more time to know that we're moving forward with this, and maybe some other people will have some interest. So I agree with what Councilmember Gillett suggested.
I am hearing some support, though, of letting Manager Keck let the public know that this may be coming forward and collecting interested folks.
Yes.
Is that fair?
I wouldn't even mind interviewing.
You wouldn't mind interviewing them?
Yeah.
Would others?
Once we form it,
Would others want to interview them?
No.
That way we'd be ready to go.
Would others want to interview them?
I go with Steve on that one. He said, I agree with what Councilmember, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call you Steve, but Councilmember Yates said, and that's that they really should know what they're getting themselves into, and so for us to approve what we're having them do before they go and sign up.
Others want to weigh in on whether or not to interview these folks? Go ahead, Steve.
For the ad hoc committee, potentially I could see them helping us determine the roles. And we'll get other folks' opinions on this, but the ad hoc committee isn't necessarily the historical preservation committee, although they'll probably roll into that, but they would help us establish what it would look like. And in that situation, I wouldn't mind interviewing and putting a committee together, but that is not the final committee,
Okay, now we've got a recommendation for an ad hoc, that would make recommendations on what the committee
let's see
should
how many
look
we
like.
can throw out there.
Yeah. Others want to weigh in on that?
Let me clarify
Yeah,
a little
go ahead.
bit on that. The reason I'm saying this is we're sitting here and we're not so sure where we want this committee to go and how we want it to be structured. And it could be very helpful to get some other input. Now, we can give these folks guidance as to what we're willing to do and what we are not willing to do, and they can work within that realm to help bring something forward. And maybe I'm overthinking this, so...
Candidly, that's my thought.
Let me ask a question of Mr. Keck here, because would that create more issues in trying to put this committee together in your eyes, or would it be helpful?
I think it could be helpful so long as the council gives some direction as to some parameters. Here's what we're willing to see, here's what we're not willing to see. And some of that has been enunciated this evening, such as Councilmember Russell has stated, no CLG, advisory only. Those are the types of things that if you did get a group of individuals together, perhaps they could help the council and staff put something together to bring back for another study session at a later date.
Okay.
Others like to
Then
weigh in on this idea?
I'll stick with my comment.
Fair enough. Any others want to weigh in on this idea? Councilmember Barrington?
I don't want to form a committee to form the committee. I think
How about
that,
a committee to form the committee?
I think the council made it very clear before, and that's why I'm somewhat confused about what came forward. We wanted an advisory committee. That isn't what got presented here. I thought we gave some pretty clear direction. We had some good conversation about it, and we need to go back to that original conversation. If there were some other issues that came forward that legal and community development were confused about, how they got shoved in to this to this extent, I'm just surprised about. I want to go back to what we originally asked for, and that's an advisory committee. I don't think it's that hard to form an advisory committee, and that we were going to go ahead and try to work with them during the process of the first year or two to see what all has been going on, get some assessments, get them started, see where we wanted to go with that. And if we felt that they needed more authority, we could do that at a later time. But what we asked for was an advisory committee and to get them started. So no, I don't. We already had the group come from the historic preservation, give their input, and I don't think I want to form a committee to have a committee.
Thank you. Rita?
Actually, I think we probably should just put on the schedule another study session to see if we could move forward with this. And then it's very possible if we have ideas by that next study session, we could do interviews in between, before June. If we're ready by March, the first part of March, then, put it out there and for an advisory committee at that point in time.
My thoughts are we're kind of overcomplicating this. I don't think we're that far off from, where we wanted to be on an advisory committee. I think the purpose language could use some work, but other than that, I think that we're relatively close in that this is an advisory body to council that will make pretty broad recommendations regarding, historic properties and historic, community issues, I guess is how I'd state it. And so, again, I was thinking we could just bring it forward, but again, I'm happy to have another study session. It does seem that we're gathering some consensus around another study session.
Can I just ask you for a clarification on what you just said?
Sure.
When you said it, I don't think we're that far apart. Do you mean what was written or what we said that we want an advisory committee?
I guess what I'm saying is I don't think we're that far apart from what staff presented as the proposed to what we suggested. I know you think there's a major disconnect there,
okay.
But I guess I'm saying I don't think there's a huge disconnect. I think there's some minor tweaking that could happen, but I think the other issue that came up as we started thinking or talking about this was, hey, staff brought up a totally separate issue of, hey, you've already got something established, and what do you want to do with that? And in my mind, that's the non-advisory piece that I think concerns you, but that's already existing policy.
And what Councilmember Jill had brought up as well. Then we disagree. So I wasn't sure which section you were talking about.
No, fair enough.
So
But I do want to try to, I think, bring us back to whether or not we want to have another study session and whether or not we should be accepting applications or interested parties. Mr. Yates.
Question before I make a statement.
Please.
So are we or are we not talking about an ad hoc committee in between now and then?
I think there's been some interest, but I don't think we have clear consensus one way or another on that.
All right,
yet.
so I'll pull back my idea of creating two committees before we get to the regular committee. For those who are listening, it's just a joke. So I definitely think we need to have another study session on this and move forward. And it may be spring before we actually interview people, and that's okay. If we're moving in a direction, but let's have it thought out.
Do you want to collect a list of interested parties or just wait until we figure this out? I'm relatively indifferent.
It could be a tally sheet as far as I'm concerned. Just if somebody's interested, just a tally. So we know that when it comes time, are we going to have 2 people apply or are we going to have 20 people apply? But not to have them fill out a formal or
no
for an
formal
interview.
Applications, but some level of interest.
Yeah.
Rick, is that kind of where you're at as well with the study session and the applicants?
No, sure. I think just because I feel I have to do that. We already have a historical preservation society with people already interested in this issue. I think there's a queue already waiting to do this. So I think we already have a sign of interest, and I don't think it'd be that hard to fill it. I'm in no rush for this. So if my previous comment made it seem like I wanted to hurry this up, I don't. I want to do it right, but at the same time, I don't want to. I agree with the comment. Let's not overthink this so, ridiculously that we can't get anything done. And I was just thinking of that. I've served for 7 years on the Code Enforcement Advisory Committee, and I've never once read or heard council say this is the job of the Code Enforcement Advisory Committee. They just look for opportunities to help the city in their role. And I kind of think that this is what this was going to do. Again, maybe I'm just overthinking it, but it doesn't seem that difficult to me. I kind of think we're almost there together, but maybe we're farther away.
And I'm sorry, because I might have done your suggestion an injustice, and I apologize for that. When you said an ad hoc committee, I thought we can form a committee anytime. We don't have to wait till June. So that's what I thought. Other people took it different. I apologize if it got skewed the wrong way.
That's okay.
My bad.
Thank you for that. So you're supportive. You're supportive of another study session, and do you want to take a list of interested parties?
Sure.
Amy, is that where you're at, or do you have any thoughts here?
Hello, Amy.
Study session is necessary, but if the other members feel it's appropriate, then I would be fine with that.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with, I agree with Amy on that. Rita, you want to see a study session, and you want to gather interested applicants?
I agree.
Yes, and Lorette, you're in the same spot too, right? You want a study session?
If anything
Definitely,
more
you've
gets
told
said,
me.
It'll be another hour. I'm not going to do that to you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we do have some consensus to bring this forward, take another shot at the language. Council will have another study session. I don't think we need to be doing any formal applications, but it sounds like we'd like some list of potential interested parties. Other questions or comments regarding this issue from council?
I'd be interested to hear what they think we want to do.
Yeah, I
Rick
agree.
definitely wants us to go another hour. Go ahead.
Well, I'm assuming in the next study session, they're going to be summarizing our comments and bringing them back and making sure that's what. So I'd rather.
That's a good idea.
It's just teasing.
Well, I think if the council is interested in having a historic preservation commission as an advisory body, I think that's a good idea. There's a lot of work that could be done by that board once they determine which direction they want to go. Certainly the survey is a very important part, I think. One of the things that we've talked about in-house was right now we have a designation that other than somebody voluntarily saying, I want my property designated, it confers no additional benefit. There's no tax credits associated with it. There's no, they don't even get a plaque for that matter. So other than having a roster somewhere that might list properties that are on our register, it doesn't really mean a lot. So in that regard, a Historic Preservation Commission that relies on voluntary applications may get you somewhere. I suspect the reason that we haven't had a lot of people go through the process is because what does it do for me? If I have a historic building, big deal, the city of Englewood has recognized it, but, now if you're on and again, the CLG approach has a lot more weight to it, but clearly that's not where council is interested in going, so
I think you do bring up an interesting issue of potential incentives, though, financial as well as non-financial, of a plaque or some sort of recognition from the public, or something that the public could touch and feel and feel connected to that history. Maybe some comments on that real quick. Is that something that folks might be interested in? Sorry to drag this out. Councilmember Barentine? I do think that's an interesting topic, though, that might help flush out.
We have a lot of interesting topics. We could.
Well, we like to flush them all out rather than having another meeting.
This entire thing, but the problem is that we agreed that we were going to let that exact issue be decided in conjunction with the board that we set up, not here. And I agreed with his question But it was whether he had the direction from council, not whether we were going to rehash issues that we've already discussed and made a decision that we were going to let this board go ahead and bring back some recommendations on ideas, what they were doing, not hash it out now. I don't think that's an appropriate thing to do.
I disagree, but Rita?
I would have liked for him to have answered the question on whether he had the direction that council just gave, not the 4 other issues that he just brought up that we weren't, had specifically said we weren't going to do.
Thank you. Rita?
Actually, I agree with Councilmember Barentine because the things that were said really troubled me. And I believe that we need an advisory committee to determine what direction we're supposed to go. Because I see the Historical Preservation Board as a board that would help us preserve the history that is in this city. And without government control doing it, I don't know what that looks like, but I think some of that, and part of the reason I agree with Councilmember Barentine, because we'll go back over and rehash all of this again. Whereas I do think we should wait until we get an advisory committee that follows the designations that we had already determined and then go from there.
It sounds to me like these are topics that are, that the council wants to consider, but, would like to get some recommendations on. So I think you bring up an interesting topic, though, of incentives, as well as some sort of public recognition elements that they may want to consider and bring forth recommendations on. Other comments or questions? Seeing none, I will thank you for coming and speaking about this evening. Let's move on to Councilmember Choice. Anybody want to kick us off? Rick, go ahead.
I want to thank staff for all they've been doing. I know Harold's been working a lot on many issues. And before you go, Harold, thank you. You guys have done a lot of work, and I know sometimes you don't hear this enough, but I appreciate all the work that you guys do. Thank you so much.
Comp plan, lots of good stuff.
There's just so much. Thank you, sir.
The new reports are great.
Yeah.
The new economic development reports.
Secondly, I don't know if I'm the only one having this problem, but I tried to log on to do my benefits, and I can't seem to get on. And I
just emailed them today too.
I've called. And
I was able to register.
I got no response.
Well, they're like you, Mr. Mayor.
My assistant helps me keep track of my login, so I think that's my secret.
I don't know if she was here today or not.
Yes, I have some information.
It's no good anymore.
I have some information that may help you.
Work, so.
It won't work, actually. Yeah, your old login doesn't work. What you need to do, and I can give this to you. Use that same email or website address, but when you log in, you have to log in for the first time again. And basically, you use your Social Security number with no dashes. Then it'll allow you to get in and do your business.
I'm going to wait for the email. I'm not going to discuss it.
Okay. You do have till Wednesday.
Yeah, we do need a little bit of support, I think. I will say candidly
Joan
that I selected the wrong plan based on the information that was provided last time. I don't know if you guys had issues with that as well, but I didn't feel like I got the best plan, what I should have picked. So now I picked a more expensive plan. I want to make sure it's right for me. So I'm like, gee, should I be buying my own insurance?
I thought I'd throw that in if anybody else was having a hard time, because I sure was.
I just contacted them directly.
I think each of us would appreciate a call or some sort of support regarding those benefit packages.
I'll have either Carrie, Bush, or Joan call tomorrow.
Thank you.
And I hope that other council members are going to show up Saturday for the parade.
Yes. I'll be here in the tree lighting, right? In the tree lighting.
I don't know if I'll be here that late that day, but I definitely want to be here for the parade. And if I haven't received, or if I have, I don't know what it came in, the actual schedule for that day.
I haven't seen one. I've just been given some basic time frames.
There is. Yeah.
Through the chamber, probably.
Yep.
We'll try to get that disseminated.
We will.
Yeah.
And that's it. Thank you. And hopefully, and if you show up, hopefully they'll do the bike ride. Joe and I were the first ones
tandem
to ride the 4-seater. And Joe pedaled for me. He's like, hey,
you kept up a little bit. You pedaled too. you know, you want to comment on the
Yeah.
decision to do the tree lighting in conjunction with that event?
Yes.
So now we're not going to do a tree lighting prior to the council meeting.
No,
Can you go
so
over that
this
a
will
little-
not interrupt your business as council. You'll be able to do it on Saturday the 3rd at 5:40. Is that right? 5:40, somewhere roughly. But the council will have the opportunity to either ride in the trolley, which we have back out ready, so be prepared to be there at about 2:45 or so, or the historic fire truck. We've got both of them be in the parade, so you can decide which one you want to ride in. Or if you want to ride your bike, you can. Or if you want to walk, you can walk. Whatever you'd
Talk
like
to any
do.
and all. Maybe they'll bring back the 4-person bike.
Allison has a schedule
Eric's
because I'm
stealing
stealing
my
her
thunder.
Who brings us back? That was about like, hey.
No, you got to stick around for the tree lighting, so we're going to leave you down here. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually I was coming tonight to talk to you about some events coming up this week, and one of them is the holiday parade. It starts at 3 o'clock, and that's in the Chase Bank parking lot. So if you're there before 3, you can hop on any of those things that Eric told you about, and it will take you down to right here, the circle. And then there's going to be some choir performances from local schools, so it'll be Inglewood children. Nixon's will be there with hot cocoa and cookies again, and then when it's dark, I've heard around 5:30, there will be the actual tree lighting.
Are we encouraging folks to stick around for that? I do worry that the parade could conclude, and then I might be by my lonesome lighting the tree.
Well,
so,
I've talked to the chamber about that too, and I think they feel like there will be enough festivities going on, and I think it gets dark early enough now that,
Fortunately.
yeah.
And so maybe we take a look at that schedule and just tighten it up a little bit so some of those performances and
happen.
whatnot with the captive audience are closer and
Close
closer
to
to
the
that
lighting,
tree
yeah.
lighting.
Hey, can I add in on there? If you want your spouse or significant other to come with you, they're welcome to ride, because my wife has offered a ride with me one time when we came. So.
Yeah, I think the more the merrier, so please come on down. It'll be interesting to see. This is obviously the first year where we've combined our tree lighting with the chamber parade. It's nice to see the chamber holiday parade come back, though. So
I want to ride on the back of Murphy's Harley. Come on, brother. Yeah.
got a Harley? I didn't even know. Anything else from you, Allison?
Yeah, I do. I have this Thursday, December 1st at 11 o'clock, we're having our first Celebrate Inglewood lunch at the Malley Center. So that is to celebrate all Inglewood employees, and we'll also have the service award recognition after the lunch and some new awards to recognize excellence in employees. And so this is the first time that all employees are invited to celebrate everyone, and you should. I think I sent you an email a couple of weeks ago, but this is just a friendly reminder. That's Thursday, 11 at Malley. Also on Thursday,
All city employees are going to be there? Is that what you just said?
Well,
Yeah, we're shutting the closing the doors?
We've invited everybody. No. We're staying open here. Yeah, we'll have everything covered here. Also, Thursday at 2 o'clock, the Small Business Development Center's Leading Edge group that we've hosted here at the Civic Center is having a graduation at Steakhouse 10. That's at 2 o'clock. I think there's about 8 to 10 businesses that participated in that, so you're welcome to attend that.
That's different from the SBA program, or is this?
It's another SBA program, but it's different constituency.
Okay, thank you.
Meals are not provided on that one, right?
I don't know.
Showing up expecting dinner, you might be surprised.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if you RSVP, they might take care of you. You know? I don't know.
I don't know, because it's at 2 o'clock, so
Yeah, it is
that makes me
Steakhouse.
think, yeah. The last thing is just to let you know that the children's art calendar for 2017 should be coming out about the second week in December. You probably get questions. I know everybody's waiting for that. And that's it.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem?
No, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Steve, anything tonight? Amy, anything tonight?
No, nothing for me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorette?
Everybody had a nice Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Rita?
I have nothing tonight.
Okay. And I have nothing tonight. Let's see. City Manager?
We just covered everything. Thank you.
Thank you. City Attorney?
Rita.
Okay. We're out of here in record time. We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, my goodness.
Hey, I forgot to respond to your text.
Oh, that's fine.
You know, it's the bird